In mid-January, 2,700 of the world's business governmental leaders gathered in the Swiss resort town of Davos for the World Economic Forum. They were there to discuss renewable energy and environmental degradation, global monetary policy, global trade and investment, the future of cities and local economies, as well as emerging technologies. This year's conference was themed Cooperation in a Fragmented World. Welcome to W3B Talks, an ongoing exploration of the impact of Web3 and blockchain technologies on business, government, and society. My name is Doug Heinzman. I'm the Chief Catalyst at the Blockchain Research Institute. In this episode, we're going to talk about the lessons learned from Davos 2023. And we're joined today by Don Tapscott, who has recently returned from Davos. Don is the executive chair and co-founder of the Blockchain Research Institute. He's one of the world's leading authorities on the impact of technology on business and society, having authored 16 widely read books, including Blockchain Revolution. He's also an adjunct professor at the INSEAD Business School and the Chancellor Emeritus of Trent University. Welcome to the podcast, Don.
Happy to be here. Great introduction.
Well, you are recently returned from Davos this year. Davos had a certain, there were some interesting questions that came out of, about after Davos about its relevance. It had been away for a few years because of the pandemic. And so this was, the first time in a number of years that the people, at the conference kind of gathered to discuss some of these very pressing issues. And, the World Economic Forum was originally, created, and its vision was to kind of facilitate a progressive, interconnected global economy that spreads democracy around the world. But arguably that vision has been under threat for, the better part of almost 15 years now since the financial crisis of 2008, as countries are kind of tending away from globalism and focusing more on local economies and political tribalism. Is Davos relevant anymore? I mean, what role does Davos play in the world as it is now?
Well, I think it's true what you say, that many of the ideas upon which Western liberal democracies, free market capitalism were based have kind of been undermined by a lot of developments in the world today. The COVID pandemic, the war in the Ukraine, you got the growth of extreme inequality, aggressive, autocracies in Russia and China, and just the inability to deal with some of these seemingly intractable problems, the biggest one, of course, being climate change, which is an existential threat. But I think that the Davos is not only relevant, it's probably more relevant than ever. Maybe I could just stand back and sort of talk a bit about what is the World Economic Forum and what is this event in Davos. And if you look at the world today, we have a lot of problems. That's for sure. And just the sheer interconnectedness of these things is quite, including climate change, interconnected food and energy crises. You got the geopolitical fragmentation, declining prosperity, and other things like that. They really do call for bold collective action, and that these global problems need global solutions. But the issue is how and by whom, and throughout the 20th century, we've had a way of dealing with this. It was one way. It was called nation states cooperating together in global institutions that address these problems. And these things came out of the meeting at Bretton Woods in New Hampshire in 1944, after the Second World War, where the winners got together and they created the IMF and the World Bank. And then a year later, the UN, and later the WTO and ILO and the GATT, Global Agreement on Trades and Tariffs, and eventually the G20 and the G8, global institutions based on nation states. And they've been the only game in town. Except since Bretton Woods, there have been some big developments. One is the rise of the civil society. There wasn't really civil society presence at Bretton Woods because there weren't any. There were 50 NGOs in the world at the time. We've also seen the rise of this third pillar of society, as they say, which is the private sector. Corporations were never viewed as a pillar of society, but they are now. And they need to change and contribute to solving these problems. And I guess the other big thing is the rise of the internet that enables all of these different types of groups to collaborate together. And I won't say little known fact, but it's not widely known. I spent 2 years of my life studying this stuff under the auspices of the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto. I led a multi-million-dollar analysis of how such new models of global cooperation could make a difference. And one of the 10 types of these new organizational forms is called a global institution. And the WEF is the prime example of that. Companies, governments, and civil society working together to collaborate, to discuss, to learn, to launch initiatives. And the WEF has no mandate from anybody to do anything. It's just trying to help out. That's the way I view it. And using the tools of the digital age, they're addressing every conceivable issue almost facing humanity, from climate change, poverty, human rights, health, the environment, economic policy, and so on. So to me, we need this type of global institution. And they don't detract from the state-based institutions. In fact, they help, because these state-based institutions, while necessary, are insufficient. So every year there's an annual meeting, but these annual meetings are actually one of probably thousands of events that take place throughout the year in 180 countries, and involving 15,000 people, of which 2/3 of them are under the age of 30. And they're all working together, trying to figure stuff out. And there's a real role for that.
Well, you've kind of you've talked to the two big elements in the theme of the conference this year: the fact that we are living in a fragmented world that has many, many challenges, and the need for there to be cooperation between the various different parties that you mentioned to tackle some of these problems, some of which, as you pointed out, were kind of existential in nature. You also kind of touched on a really interesting development that I think probably is now more pronounced than any time in history, that there are a number of specifically technology companies that have the reach and resources that are frankly greater than most nation states. And so it's kind of an interesting dynamic where, you've got not only policymakers and political leaders, but business leaders that have real political and economic power on a global scale. I mean, how does that dynamic play out when they all kind of get together in Davos?
Well, there's this view that it's a big, happy party and everyone's getting along just great, but there are real debates, and I participate in them every year. And you're right, of course, the so-called big tech. We did a paper, 2000. I'll have to look that up. It was 15 years ago, easily, announcing a new species of business called a digital conglomerate. I'm referring to companies like, Facebook, Google, Amazon, Apple, and so on. And they can rapidly evolve into adjacent or not so adjacent industries because they own the asset class of the digital age, which is data. And 5 of these companies own half of NASDAQ. So everyone talks about, well, they're monopolies and maybe we got to break them up. That may be true, but that's not the real problem. The real problem is not that they're monopolies, it's that they're increasingly owning the economy or big parts of it. So, well, they're all under duress now and laying off people and so on. You know what? These are the most valuable companies and they're the most powerful companies. Now, can they contribute effectively to solving problems in the world? Well, yes and no. Some things they can help out and other things that are just not going to be doable. Like on the issue of our data, we create this data, but it gets captured by them. Facebook's not going to adopt a new model where you get to own, monetize, and control your own data. That's just not going to ever happen. So this is an epic kind of battle in many ways. It's taking place between people, maybe governments, even companies, for sure civil society organizations that agree to have self-sovereign identity on the one hand, and those who currently own the asset of the digital age. And old paradigms die hard, and leaders of the old fight against a new model. But more broadly, I mean, I think the whole issue of technology was kind of huge at Davos as well.
Well, so you just you touched upon a really, really fascinating topic. I well imagine with all the various different stresses that you just talked about, that there is tension, right? I mean, and President Zelensky was there, and the First Lady of Ukraine was there too. Well, Zelensky gave a presentation remotely, but the First Lady was there in person, and I understand that there were hecklers that took umbrage and objected to that presentation. There's obviously tensions about the war in Europe and the state of energy. Obviously, conflict around natural resources and indigenous peoples and the climate, as well as the one that you just alluded to, right? These different visions about how society and the various different rules of society and the economy, work going forward, and that some of these companies may have, a vision that is in conflict with what the objectives are of some of the political leaders there. So, how do those tensions, those stresses, play out when you're actually there in the middle of those conversations?
Well, with great force. I mean, you think about it, the world is very divided and it is fragmented, and social media has got a lot to do with that, by the way. There's been a fragmentation of public discourse. The whole question of the truth. What is the truth? Who would believe that we're talking about this in 2022? Around fundamental facts, science, medicine, where there used to be kind of like the truth. Gravity, things fall. That's been challenged. And I was at a session where the publisher of the New York Times and many others were talking about this, that when you have a breakdown in what is the truth, you get a breakdown in trust. And that leads to a breakdown in social capital. And that leads to a crisis of legitimacy of all of our institutions, like democracy. So you've got the people who think it's okay to make up the truth, and those who are on the side of the truth. Now, of course, not everything is a fact. There are lots of gray areas where there's a matter of opinion, but there's some things where the truth can be discerned. Like, for example, was the U.S. election faked? Well, that was the most scrutinized election in American history and probably in any country ever. The truth is known within a tiny degree of freedom. And it certainly wasn't, Donald Trump did not win that election. That is the truth. He admitted that. He knows that. But there's a conflict, between the people who believe in facts and those who don't. You've got a conflict. Of course, a really big one is the United States was the most powerful entity in the world, and the idea of free market capitalism, Western liberal democracy, was being pushed out around the world. Well, that's now being challenged initially by Russia. You have to remember that Russia carries or swings a much bigger stick in the world than would be warranted by its economy. Its economy is actually smaller than Canada's. But the real big one, of course, is China. And this has happened historically, that when you have a dominant country or power in the world, empire, whatever, and it gets replaced by a new one, there's typically a war. And there's a lot of anti-China saber rattling and a lot of anti-American stuff going on the other hand. And this is a very kind of volatile situation. So, we've got people with different points of view about the pandemic and how to handle the pandemic. There are different points of view about climate change. That Al Gore got up at this really powerful session. There were some other amazing leaders there, an indigenous woman. And he was talking about how there's astronauts, when they go up into space, they can see a thin blue line surrounding the planet. And this line is 5 to 7 kilometers thick. So for stretched out, Al was saying that you could drive a car through it in 5 minutes. He says, we're dumping 600,000 Hiroshimas into that thin blue line every day. He says, we're making some progress, but overall, we are losing this battle. And you think about, well, what does it mean to lose the battle? Well, the smart scientists I talk to say in the next 10, 15 years, you get 1.5 billion people who lose most of their water supply. So you think we have a problem with migration today in the world with 1 million people coming into Europe? Imagine 1.5 billion people in motion. And water supply is just one of many tough issues related to climate change. And, I've talked to some scientists. These are like top people in the world. And they say, we're screwed. Now, I can't admit that. I can't deal with that. I can't deal with thinking about my grandchildren and their children. And, I don't think anyone's saying that humanity is going to be wiped out, but civilization as we know it will change quite fundamentally with these huge disruptive things that are going on. So these kinds of conflicts basically are emerging in the world. And I would say, the overall environment at Davos was not very encouraging. I'll just give you one little example. So on the main street of Davos gets turned into a giant private kind of, I won't say trade show, but there are all these little stores that sell cuckoo clocks and things get taken over by big corporations, and they make more money in a week than they do all year, selling Swiss Army knives and whatever. And one of them was a big conference that actually occurred in a hotel on the main street. And it was organized by a European group that holds the big crypto conference. So I gave the opening speech to this thing. And the woman who organizes it is Ukrainian. So after I spoke, she got up and she was talking about how blockchain was used to support the Ukrainian resistance. And she talked for about 5 minutes about this. And this guy with a Russian accent stands up at the back of the room and starts yelling in a very nasty way about, what is this? Is this a crypto conference? I didn't come here to listen to all this propaganda. And you could hear a pin drop. People didn't even turn around. And he was really mad. And he got up, he knocked over his chair, he stomped out of the room, threw his badge on the desk, and headed down the stairs. There is a war going on in Europe. So, if anything, the world is becoming very conflicted. And I don't see a clear path forward. I mean, we're doing lots of stuff here at the Blockchain Research Institute on a new social contract, but it just underlined to me the importance of institutions like the World Economic Forum, but also the importance that all of us need to step up, and get involved in these issues. Because if we don't, the future is something that can be achieved, but it's going to require humans and humans cooperating.
Yeah, well, I think, you're kind of an essential point that, we've got all these daunting challenges in front of us. But to solve these problems, we're going to need to, work together and to cooperate, which of course is part of the theme for the conference. But in order to cooperate, we kind of need to have a common scaffolding, right? So that we have, not only the mechanism, the tools that allow us to cooperate and to align our interests, but that we have a common view of what reality is, what the truth is. And it's only upon that foundation that we're going to be able to build these, solutions to these very important problems. So in many ways, that issue is very, very central to, the prospects of us solving these problems, which kind of leads me to my next question, because, we've been dealing with the truth issue, certainly from a business and even from a governmental standpoint, and, the role that technologies like blockchain play to establish, kind of common understandings of transactional status. But, I was reading that there was quite a bit of discussion about AI and, ChatGPT and how, people start to become reliant on some of these engines and the inherent, bias and misinformation that may be part of their training set, that we have yet new opportunities to propagate divergent views about what the truth is. What's your kind of take on that? And kind of more broadly, what were the other kind of big breakout ideas and themes that emerged from the conference?
Well, as for technology, this was the AI Web3 conference. In that order. I mean, AI was everywhere because of ChatGPT, generative AI. And, there are the short-term issues, like how will teachers and professors know that the student wrote the essay. And I was talking to Stuart Russell, who's a prof at Berkeley, and Eric Brynjolfsson, guys actually collaborated with us closely over the years. And he co-authored with Andrew McAfee a very good book called The Second Machine Age. And he's at Stanford now, used to be at MIT. And they were talking about ways that they're just going to handle a short-term problem. One is that there's going to be a lot more handwriting. There's going to be a lot more conversations, like defending your thesis. You write an essay, you're going to have to talk about it. And he said, I think it was Eric who said, I'm going to tell my students, fine, create your first draft using ChatGPT. And then I want to see a final draft that's very different. And you explain to me why it's different. So there's that short-term stuff, but longer term, Stuart was on a panel that I was on talking about the implications of technology on society and civilization. And he was saying, generative AI, so think about that, the next version of ChatGPT, maybe you'll be able to say to it, show me a detailed plan to organize everything at the World Economic Forum Davos meeting. And the version after that is execute all that. Just do it. Organize the meeting. And he says all the hundreds of people involved in putting this thing together, you don't really need them. So he was explaining is, we've talked at the Blockchain Research Institute about how this first kind of generation of technology automated, the lower level blue collar clerical type functions. And there's lots of that still to happen, even with the next generation. 48 out of 50 states, the number one job type for men is truck driver, and the number one job type for women is cashier. So those are going to go probably in the next decade. Cashier's kind of already going. But the next level is this moving into less structured, higher level knowledge work, analyzing x-rays, dispensing pharmaceuticals, stuff like that. So these are big issues that everyone is trying to come to grips with. And then around, Web3, blockchain, and crypto, of course, the Davos occurred in the aftermath of FTX. And a lot of the conversation was pretty negative about, crime and regulation and so on. And there's certainly a role for regulation. But one panel, I was in the audience. I did participate in the discussion, but, it had a bunch of people talking about regulating crypto. And so I said, well, just a second here. What are we talking about crypto? Crypto refers to the digitization of all assets. So we're going to regulate carbon credits that get tokenized. We're going to regulate NFT and art. Do you want to regulate governance tokens that enable us to manage new decentralized environments? Eventually all assets are going to become contained within a token, kind of like a container, like a carbon credit, or represented by a token like a barrel of oil. So we need to have a broader view. And I was reminded of the importance of what we do here at the BRI, just developing frameworks, scaffolding, if you like, language to be able to talk about all these things.
So, yeah, I too have been kind of fascinated by these headlines about ChatGPT that have now, passed medical exams and legal exams and those sorts of things. And I actually remember, I went to grad school in France, and in the European tradition, we did oral defenses of, our papers, and did oral exams all the time, where you stood before a panel of examiners, and they basically, questioned you to explore your comprehension and grasp of the material. So perhaps we'll see, some of that. But I do tend to agree with you that ultimately these things are tools, and they go to productivity, right? It used to be that some 74% of the working population was involved in agriculture, and now it's less than 4% because we have, tractors and harvesters and all kinds of things that just make the whole process that much more productive. And in a similar sort of way, the automation of transportation or of cash registers and commerce and of organizing a conference like Davos, that all these technologies contribute to productivity. And, I suppose part of my question becomes that stems out of that is that all the conflict you're talking about is largely a question of too many people competing for too few resources. And, the fear and resentment that stems out of that problem is the basis for, an awful lot of the challenges that are manifesting. So, do you see these Web3 technologies, some of this AI technology that people are understandably kind of fearful of because they're new and uncertain? We don't know the rules and regulations that need to be formed around them. But are you fundamentally a techno-optimist that these technologies will allow us to, improve productivity and alleviate the pressures that are driving a lot of the tension and conflict in our society?
Am I a techno-optimist? No, I'm not. I think that Well, first of all, when it comes to employment and labor markets, I've always been of the view that Schumpeter was right, that, under capitalism, what happens is old industries get smashed and new ones get formed, and ultimately there's a growth in the economy and in prosperity and in jobs. That is not happening. The economy is growing, but prosperity is declining. There's lots of employment, but most people are having trouble getting by, living paycheck to paycheck. There's underemployment, not unemployment. And with these new technologies, it took the shift from agrarian to industrial a couple hundred years almost to happen. This thing is happening in I wouldn't even count it in decades. It's like in years, a couple of decades overall. And I think that we're going to see big structural changes to the economy, and that there will be structural unemployment. And so how are we going to handle that? Well, it's the thing that I've written a lot about as part of this, thinking about a new social contract, that we need to democratize the factors of production and consumption, engaging more people in the economy in new ways, to harvest its largesse. That we're going to need a guaranteed annual income, but that's, a guaranteed basic income, but that's not enough. You can't have people starving to death in the United States by the millions. But there was a lot of talk at Davos about what does it mean to have a good job or a meaningful job or meaningful work. And I think that we're going to have to make a principle in society that everyone has the right to a job. You know what? And if the market can't provide it, we'll find other ways. Civil society, philanthropy, or government. The best government is no government. Well, that old Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher idea has been seriously discredited. Now, it doesn't mean governments are great, but we need more stuff in the commons, and we need to find a way to make that work. And as for optimism, I really do believe that it's people, not technology, that solves problems. Now, of course, we've got a new generation of technology that's kicking in here that it can go either way. It can seriously disrupt society as we've known it. Look what the internet and social media did to public discourse and the whole concept of the truth. This is all around the world now. That movement in Brazil, and what was sparked, inspired by Trump, but it was organized and discussed around social media. And everyone's in their little self-reinforcing echo chambers. And the purpose of information is not to inform us. It's to give us comfort and help us organize around whatever weird version of the truth we may have. So, yeah, there are technological solutions that can help. Using blockchain, you can know the provenance of a fact. You can have an immutable record of the truth. But I think that stuff is absolutely necessary. But again, it's insufficient. We're going to need a new social contract, a new way of thinking about how government, companies, civil society works together to create value, to create wealth, to create prosperity, and to solve problems.
So if I had to kind of summarize, and correct me if I'm taking too many liberties, but it seems to me that you're saying that while it's true that the global economy over the last, 40, 50 years has created an enormous amount of wealth, that it has not been distributed and as equitably as it needs to be in order to promote a civil society, a stable society, and in modern times, that because of the nature of things like social media, that in fact objective reality and objective truth hasn't been equitably and efficiently distributed across society, and that these that these challenges are, arguably some of the most fundamental ones that we need to tackle. Is that a fair, encapsulation of what you're trying to say?
Sorry, would you just repeat the last sentence?
Well, I was trying to draw a parallel between, the idea of distributing wealth as a means of allowing, society to be stable and productive. But distributing truth is increasingly a problem. You talked about echo chambers of people getting, reinforcing biases and, finding like-minded people and spending all their time in those echo chambers and how that manifests itself in terms of, unhealthy behaviors in society. So, how is it fair to say that we need to find new, more democratic or mechanisms to equitably distribute not only wealth, but also, objective reality?
Well, it's an interesting idea. First of all, I said this in my TED Talk. I think it was in Blockchain Revolution, which is now 7 years ago or more, that the only solution that we have currently to economic inequality is a redistribution of wealth. Why couldn't, and well, for sure, some of that's going to be required. And Elon Musk got to pay tax like everybody else. So should Donald Trump. But I think that we're going to need to approach this differently. And the term that I used was the pre-distribution of wealth. Let's democratize and decentralize the way that the economy works so that people are more directly engaged. And, we could decentralize finance, could onboard millions of people to global markets, return tens of trillions of dollars into the pockets of citizens. Next generation software can do a lot of what banks do. We could codify real and intellectual property rights and digital assets and create public infrastructure that the creators among us can that they can use to manage IP rights and connect directly with the fans or the rightful owners of land or livestock or natural resources. And they can prove their ownership. You could have digital cooperatives like DAOs that could shepherd in a new halcyon age of entrepreneurship, the pre-distribution of wealth. And as for the truth, I think the idea of, let me say, decentralizing truth is a powerful one. That in the past, truth came from above. It came from trusted institutions and hierarchies. Well, maybe we can find new ways of decentralizing truth, where truth can be established through networks and through technologies, where, I'll just give you an example, where we can restore trust. For example, you vote on a blockchain and you have incontestable evidence that your vote has been cast for the person for whom you voted, and cryptographic proof that it cannot be moved to somebody else or eliminated. So I think this is a really good topic for conversation. How do we decentralize the establishment of the truth and of trust?
So these concepts, they're in many ways they're pretty radical in terms of they're very discrete or different from kind of the way that things work in the world today. Is this discussion happening at Davos, or do you think that Davos is a forum in which these kinds of discussions can or should happen?
Well, they're starting to happen. In some ways, I don't know if Klaus Schwab were here and you asked him, is the mission of the forum really to help build a new social contract for a new age? He'd call it the fourth industrial age. I think he'd probably say yes. I haven't talked to him directly about this, but I know that when I raised the idea on stage of a new social contract, I had people coming up to me and saying, why didn't I think of that? That's exactly what we need. So this is a big passion of mine, and I'm going to spend a lot of time, um, a lot of time working on it and thinking about it. I'm welcome, by the way, anyone who's listening to this, any ideas. I mean, the big themes for me is around the problem of ownership of data, creating a self-sovereign identity. Secondly, around this whole problem of the prosperity paradox, economy is growing, prosperity is declining. The idea of distributing wealth. Thirdly, the civil discourse. How do we create an informed society, establish the truth? Fourth is about the crisis of legitimacy of democracy. What are some new things that we need to do? I think tinkering with democracy is not going to work. We're going to have to build a new model. And around climate stability, how are we going to mobilize planet Earth to reindustrialize the planet? And so, bring it on. Anyone who's got ideas on all of those, I'd welcome them.
So if you were the program director for Davos 2024, what would the theme be? What would you choose as the theme?
Oh boy, I don't know. Let's let our listeners, given everything that I've said here today, let's let them pitch in.
Okay,
and,
so that's fair.
I mean, if I were doing it, I'd call towards a new social contract. But I think that politically, that would not be very good for the World Economic Forum that right now is being accused of trying to force its agenda. Through little tricks like mandated vaccines with microchips in them that will turn us all into automatons controlled by George Soros and Bill Gates. Yeah. So I think they need to be a little careful about being too grandiose. And that's why the theme this year of cooperation in a fragmented world was kind of a low-key good one.
Okay, so fair enough. So my final question, what do you think the relevance and the future relevance and the future of the World Economic Forum at Davos is going to be going forward?
Well, as I said, it's one of 10 types of these new multi-stakeholder networks for global problem solving, cooperation, and governance. And I think it's got a big future. And as do all 9 types, that we're going to need more cooperation and more joint action to tackle these problems in the world. We need more discussion, more debate, more fresh ideas. And, those people, I just had a debate, a monk debate, actually, with a very thoughtful guy, wrote the book Davos Man. And it's a podcast. I think it's going to be available on the Monk Debate podcast this week. And, he was very down on Davos. Now, he's very down on billionaires, and he's kind of got a point there. But, and there are billionaires at Davos, probably less than 1% of the people there, a lot less than 1%. But, overall, we're going to need everybody kind of cooperating. And it doesn't mean that business is somehow going to wake up and become enlightened and understand that business can succeed in a world that's failing. There are people like that. Paul Pullman from Unilever, who I met at Davos many years ago. He's an example of the kind of CEO that if we had, we'd have a better world, or we'd be making a lot more progress. Most businesses change because they have to, because the customers are not going to buy crappy products or products that pollute the environment or products that are built by children. And they change because of regulation. And some of them change out of peer pressure. But this is not going to be a big, fun conversation. We're in for a period of struggle, for mobilization, for organization, and for conflict, if we're going to find a way to make this smaller world that my grandchildren inherit a better one.
Okay, well, that's a great place to leave this. Do you plan on being back at Davos in 2024?
I'm not invited every year. They mix it up, but I typically am. So if I am, I'll go.
And you
Invited, I'll go.
you would encourage anyone that has the opportunity to take advantage of it?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, it's like your brain will explode with new ideas, and your life will be changed with the new connections that you make.
Wow,
that's been my experience.
Well, thank you so much, Don, for sharing your insights, your impressions, and the lessons learned from Davos 2023. And thank you all for joining us for this episode of W3B Talks. You can find research on this and other topics at blockchainresearchinstitute.org. I'm your host, Doug Heintzman. We hope that you'll join us for our next episode of W3B Talks.